Welcome to Being Human with me, your host, Steve Cuss. We do a number of things on this show, and one of the things that we do is we help you explore your precious belief in Jesus versus some of your core beliefs, some that you may know that you have and some that you may not be aware that you have. The simple idea being that if we're not careful, our core beliefs take over and actually infect our ability to experience the God we believe in. So Jesus is my most precious belief, but then I have these other assumptions about myself and the world. I have these conditions by which I think the world must be for me to feel connected and okay. I've done a whole episode on that. You can look through our archive from a few weeks ago when we actually went right into detail on precious versus core belief. But I just wanted to share one that I've really been engaging God with lately. Honestly, it's a little embarrassing to admit, but I have this core belief that is really stubborn, that believes that what the world needs is my opinion. Or another way to say it is, particularly if I'm scrolling through social media, and quite frankly, particularly if it's Twitter, my core belief comes to the surface that I must reply, that I must respond, that the world must have my voice. Now, that is embarrassing to share, but it's also, I'm quite comfortable sharing it because I think a lot of you have that core belief as well, because we all feel this need to say something. And that sometimes means putting someone in their place, something like that. So over the last few weeks, I've been paying attention to the impact of social media on my own well-being, on my own connection. And what I do is actually I try to do some brave practice, which looks like I intentionally navigate social media mindful of God's presence. You know, what is God calling me to do? This is for another episode, but I do confess that I struggle to know when to speak up and when to be silent on various things. But I see so many people speaking up, adding their voice, that I'm not convinced that's always healthy. So my general posture is to try to connect to God and restrain from speaking up. So I'm going to light our candle today. Just as a reminder, we light our candle, even those of you joining us audibly, just to help us get off the anxiety treadmill and relax into God's presence. And this being a 3-wick candle, I'm going to light it to acknowledge the Father, creator of the heaven and earth, and the Son, who emptied himself and came to live among us and then died for us and then conquered death. And the Spirit, who is our comforter and also our convictor, who animates us, in whom we live and move and have our being. Father, Son, and Spirit. I'll be honest, I don't get the Trinity, but I have staked my life on it. And so we relax into the mystery of God. And today I'm going to invite you, as you listen in on my interview, just starting in a minute or so, maybe just have another think about, is there a core belief that is driving my life right now? The way it works for me, if things are well, it's easier for me to trust God. And if things are not well, I tend to take things into my own hands. And I tend to need the world to be a certain way for me to be okay. So faith for me is being okay in God's hands regardless of the circumstances. I make that sound much easier than it really is. And just one simple, tangible example for me is my social media behavior. My guest today is Jay Kim. I love Jay. I love talking to him. I love learning from Jay. He's the lead pastor at Westgate Church out there in Silicon Valley, San Jose area. He'd written a couple of books in the past, Analog Church, Analog Christian, the idea, how do we live an analog life in our digital age? His latest book, Listen, Listen, Speak. That's the title, Listen, Listen, Speak. It's amazing. I think it is the book for 2024, honestly. I think it's the book to help us survive an election year. I love Jay because he's so thoughtful, but also what I really appreciate is the way he takes very practical spiritual practices and puts theology into them. And we get into that into this episode. And so now let's just hear from Jay. Jay, I want to start asking you about God's pace versus our pace. You have this amazing thought about God being infinite and us being finite and how that affects our pace of life?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think you said it. There is such a delta between timelessness and time, but theologically, for Christians, what we at least intellectually believe is that God is eternal. I think that's misunderstood sometimes. This idea, the word, the name, one of the names for God is El Olam, and it reflects timelessness and eternity, but not eternity the way creatures like us who are fixed in time thinking about it. Like, because you and I live in time, when I think eternal, I think point A is the moment that my existence began. And eternity means from point A, it just sort of moves up and to the right forever. And that arrow never ends and it never bends. But that's not what eternity means when the Bible talks about eternity with God and the eternity that awaits us. It means that God exists outside of those categories. So it's not point A and then up and to the right forever in a line that never ends and never bends. It is, there is no line. There is no line. God exists outside of that XY axis, that grid, that we typically think of, especially in our sort of like cultural obsession with progress. It's really hard to fathom a God for whom progress doesn't even really make sense. Progress sort of infers that you have a starting point and some, predetermined or at least preferred end point, and you are progressing to that point. But God is eternal. He exists outside of all of those things. You think about the great sacrifice of Christ on the cross and what the New Testament writers say about people like Abraham, who he wasn't alive when Jesus, came. He was alive before that. So, but it's all credited to him, his righteousness, his faith in a reality he did not fully know. And I think that's us too. And it's been helpful for me on a personal level. I'm generally quite driven. Some might describe me, at least in some ways, as quite type A, and very much so like the up and to the right trajectory thing. It sounds like I'm critiquing it, but really it's self-indictment. I get very enamored with that sort of thing as well. I want more and more, and I want it more quickly. And if we're not growing, we're dying, all those things, all those like weird cultural myths. It's very easy for me to buy into them. I'm susceptible. And so it's been helpful to remind myself, God doesn't live on that grid. And my idea of progress is certainly not God's idea of the formational journey, and this is where a lot of your work has been so helpful for me when I find myself not living right-sized or human-sized. Typically when I find myself tempted to get big, it's because I am trying to impose my will on that line and force it up and to the right, and typically be out of insecurity that if that line goes down into the left, that, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do, and therefore I am not who I'm supposed to be, those sorts of lies. And it's been so helpful to think about the fact that God doesn't exist confined to those parameters. So, El Olam, God, eternal God, he exists outside of all of that.
When I think of the two kind of movie contexts that freak me out the most, the first one is the submarine. I struggle to watch movies with submarines because I'm afraid of being contained. But Jay, the second one is outer space. Movies like Gravity and Interstellar. And it's because it's too expansive. There's too much room. When I think about eternity for too long, I literally get a shiver in my body. It's like, ugh. Does that happen to you, or do you relax into the idea of eternity?
I don't get a shiver. It's so interesting you mention Interstellar. I was watching Interstellar last night. So It's actually, oddly enough, one of my favorite movies.
I hear that a lot. I know I'm an outlier.
No, but you know why, though? I totally relate to what you're saying. Um, why it is one of my favorite movies. I don't know if you've actually seen it or you just
Oh,
refuse or what. You have seen it. I think one of the reasons why I love Interstellar, without giving away too much of the plot point, to me, it felt so very much like really a movie about a father's love for his daughter and a daughter's love for her dad, set within the context of eternity and
yeah.
vastness. And I think that's why it's so beautiful. I remember I watched the movie when it came out before Jenny and I had children. And then watching it again last night, I saw it in the theater before we had kids, and watching it again last night and having my 8-year-old daughter, which is right around the age of one of the characters in the film early on, having my 8-year-old daughter just down the hallway and my 5-year-old son in the bedroom next to her. I just thought, man, that's it. And the reason is because the simplicity of, this love I have for these little kids. It is simple and it's small, and yet it is as wide as the universe. There is an eternal, outside of time sort of element to it, even though my love for them is, frail and flawed. And then I think about God's love for us, which is not frail and it is not flawed. And he truly does exist outside of time. And yet he is so anchored, as near as our very next breath, which is a grand mystery, that the entire universe is sort of in this very next breath I take. The Spirit of God in me is the expanse of the cosmos.
Man, you've kind of sold me on maybe taking a second watch at it. Well, you are kind of known as the analog guy in a digital age. It's fascinating, Jay. You're a Silicon Valley pastor. You wrote your books on being an analog church and analog Christian. You've now come out with what I think is the book for 2024, Listen, Listen, Speak. Why 2 listens and 1 speak? That seems a little counterintuitive.
Oh, gosh. There's lots of reasons. I mean, some of it, I guess, is what we heard growing up. Hey, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. But more than that, it's a reminder to myself. Typically, I listen in order to be able to formulate while listening, which isn't really listening. But as I'm listening, I'm formulating the thing I'm going to say, the thing I'm going to speak in response. So, your words then become simply the canvas upon which I will paint my verbal masterpiece. And I have found myself getting into so much trouble because of that, in my marriage, in various relationships, in my leadership, with people that I work with, congregants that I love and serve. I've been a pastor long enough to have gotten myself in plenty of trouble. And a lot of it, not all of it, but so much of it was because I was listening simply as a means to get to my turn, and react. And so the middle listen is a reminder to me, listen so that you can listen some more. And then maybe, at that point, maybe there's something meaningful to say. And maybe there isn't. So then, it's just the publisher would not allow me to call the book like 12 listens and then speak. That just would not have made for a good book title. So we settled on the 2 listens and then speak. But if I could, I would have had it be, a bunch of listens and then maybe speak kind of thing.
It really is counterintuitive to say maybe the world doesn't need me to speak. You have a beautiful story about being with somebody at the end of life. And I think somehow that story just ties all of this together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it's like to be with somebody as their life is ending.
Yeah, the story I tell, I mean, this is your world. You've got such profound stories of scenes like this. But the story I tell in the book, I was a youth pastor at the time in my early 20s. It was my first pastoral sort of local church job. And one day I get the call to do my first sort of bedside deathbed visit, to go visit this older gentleman in our church, a real saint, beloved. And I'm like 24 or something. I'm wrapping up seminary. I'm going to Fuller Seminary, reading all these books that were way over my head. I thought I was smarter than I actually was. And so on my drive over, in the time prepping for it and on my drive over, man, it's basically I'm just writing a mini sermonette in my mind. And I was really prepared to go and like essentially preach this man to death, like quite literally. And I walk in, and I didn't know it was this, but I'm just basically wearing my insecurity, the fact that I am uncomfortable and totally out of my element and unfamiliar in that sort of setting. And so I cover that up by with words, no listening, just I'm going to speak my way through the situation. If I could, I'm a preacher, so words are my sort of tool, and I'll just use them. I'll use them to get through the situation. So I just start talking my head off, and giving him everything I could about what I don't even remember what I was saying. And pretty early on in that conversation, Earl, he's weak and frail. He was in his final days, but with this like very weak grin on his face with warmth. His finger goes up to his mouth, and he just kind of gives me the shh kind of sign. And in that moment, I just thought, oh, this is it. I'm done. Like I have failed as a pastor. And then he, I'll never forget it. He just said these simple words. He said, "Jay, read me the Psalms." That's what he said. And I felt so free. I felt, I was there to minister to him, but with that one little line, he ministered to me. And what I realized was, he could have had anybody read him the Psalms, or he could have, somebody could have given him a Bible lap and he could have played it, at his bedside and had the Psalms read. What he was not saying was, "Jay, I don't need you to be here. I just need the Bible. What do you even do?" That's not what he was saying. What he was saying was, "I am so glad you are here with me. Now let us allow the true words of life to minister to both of us, like that's the thing I need. And not just the words read from like a machine or something, but the words embodied in another human. That's the gift you can offer me. It's not your words, your ideas, your insecurity, your whatever, but the words of life that might come to life in your voice and in your cadence and with your embodied presence." So that was, over 20 years ago, and I'll never forget it. And it changed almost everything about how I enter really painful situations like that. And it's such a gift. I think about Earl quite often still, and am so grateful.
So in Listen, Listen, Speak, one of the gifts you give us, Jay, is you really dive into the way we are formed by our technology, the way we are formed by social media habits, the way they can make it so challenging for us to listen to God. Could we do a quick breakdown of your opinion? Could you give us a quick summary of what's the difference between Facebook, Insta, Twitter, and whatever else you want to talk to us about, and how they're forming us?
Yeah, I think big picture, there is consistency across all of those platforms to a certain extent. I think a lot about Neil Postman, who was a late 20th century, many people in the listening would know him. He wrote, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he was really commenting on television and the age of television, and how information had essentially become entertainment, that it was now detached from any particular thing we could do or should do. And I think about social media, I think one of the things that's sort of uniformly true about all social media is that that's primarily what it is. It's entertainment sort of fiending as vital information. That's not to say there is not vital information on social media. There is, absolutely. But the overwhelming majority of most of our feeds are not that. It's typically stuff that has shock value, is like, it's essentially seeking to grab our attention. It does very little to really hold. When you think about sort of each of the platforms, it's interesting, and some of this people will already know and be familiar with. All of them are driven by particular types of algorithms that are designed to just maximize its ability to hijack our attention, because our attention is the means to profitability for these companies. I'm not, it's not some sort of blanket critique about tech companies, but there is something to be said for the way it's structured and incentivized. But yeah, you think about Instagram, a very image-based platform, but you see how all of these platforms are all sort of like playing off of each other now. So with Facebook and Instagram, both owned by the same parent company, you see a lot of the platforms sort of sharing, a lot with video. And then, of course, there's like so much hubbub and controversy right now with TikTok and what may or may not happen with TikTok and how information is being exchanged there. But all of it really is a sort of sensory overload it's all designed for sensory overload, intended to, and this is hard to hear, but it's true. It's really all of it. All those platforms are designed to keep us quite anxious. There's a journalist named Matt Taibbi. He wrote a book a number of years ago called Hate Inc. And he talks about how all media, he basically says media has to keep you anxious and addicted to conflict, but it needs you to come in really, really angry. And he says that social media and all media these days, the way it's designed, it needs its audience to bring a series of assumptions. If you do not bring those assumptions, then essentially what the media produces, it will actually seem really illogical or offensive even. And so I think whether it's through images or short 240 character, tweets, or longer sort of written text on Facebook or wherever else, they're all designed to sort of overload various senses with the same intent and purpose, which is to keep us anxious, angry, really addicted to conflict, because that's the thing that keeps us coming back for more. It's quite different than, to say, like walking slowly through a museum or something. You think about just scrolling Instagram. It's very different than if you were to take a stroll through the Art Institute in Chicago. They're just very different experiences. If you were to walk through, I'm thinking about the Art Institute in Chicago because I love it. I'll be there in a couple of weeks, and I'm just so looking forward to it. And what I know about my experience when I'm there, typically I'm in Chicago with my family, but I'm taking this trip alone for some things. I'm actually quite looking forward to like 3 hours of just alone time in the museum. And what I know about my experience those 3 hours is that my phone will be away, and I will not scroll through the pieces. My goal will not be to see as much as I can. My goal will be to see as deeply as I can. Like, I'll stand in front of Hopper's Nighthawks for 10, 15, 20 minutes. I'll just stand there and stare at it. I know that I will, because you give it enough time and you begin to see this thing illuminated in a whole new way. And it begins to tell you stories that you cannot possibly receive within a matter of seconds. And yet that's the way we look at Instagram or read Twitter or X or whatever. And the real danger in that is it forms us into a people who begin to see other human beings, not as pieces of magnificent art that deserve and demand our attention for extended periods of time, but as, Instagram reels that we just kind of scroll through. If it doesn't grab my attention, if this person does not grab my attention right away, then scroll and on to the next. And I think that's what's happening to us. Being formed into that type of person is just, it's a really dangerous reality that I think we're all facing today.
This is fascinating, Jay. So the other thing it seems to do is it forces me to have an opinion, a strong opinion. I go from not knowing about it, whatever it is, to very quickly having a strong and combative opinion about it. Me at my worst, I have too many opinions to start with. At my default, at my worst, I'm very opinionated. I think it's part of God's transformation in me. And so I see that in social media. What is it about it that forces me to have a strong opinion?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think human beings, we think narratively. So even if you experience something quickly, just as a human, for most of us, our brains and our bodies need to form and create some narrative about it. Um, this is why if somebody cuts me off on the road, my temptation, what I don't do is like, oh gosh, I just got cut off. Maybe they're busy, and then move on. That's not what happens to me. Typically, what will happen is I just got cut off by that person, and then my brain will just make up some wild narrative about that person that is very likely untrue. It might be true, but it's probably untrue. It certainly cannot possibly be true in full. So whatever narrative I'm making up. So even these quick little, moments, we think narratively. So that's what happens on social media. It's what happens on Instagram. This is why Facebook comments during the political season get so wild. It's we've all seen it where somebody posts one little thing about some, politician or some candidate of choice or whatever. And then we've all seen that experience where one person jumps on and then another, and then the comment section just gets crazy. And then the person has to shut off their comments or something. Well, it's not because anybody believes truly that typing this vitriolic thing that'll be the thing that will completely reverse course and change this person's mind. Like most of us know that's very unlikely. And yet we keep going. Some of that is just pride and I need to have the last word or win the argument. Some of it, I think a lot of it actually, is because we are narrative. And I need to bring closure or end this story. I need to write the final chapter. Otherwise, I can't handle just living in the ether of I don't know, how does the story end? We do that with everything and everybody. And social media, again, because it's sort of an attention grabbing, very fast, quick twitch, swipe, scroll, click type of experience, we're training our brains to jump to conclusions, to wrap up narratives very quickly about very complex creatures called humans, and I think that's really dangerous, especially when you think about just entering the political season and all that's ahead of us and all the potential for division and vitriol and all those sorts of things. And so, again, that's why I think about C.S. Lewis's quote, I think in The Weight of Glory, where he says, "You have never met a mere mortal." He's got this wonderful thing. He goes on and on. It's really beautiful. He calls them, eternal horrors or everlasting splendors is what he says, something like that. And, but social media doesn't want us to believe that truth. Social media wants us to see everybody else as a sort of caricatured avatar version of a character in a story that I am writing about reality. And I just think to live sanely and at peace, we have to be far more humble than that. We have to realize the human story is not a story I am writing. The human story is a story that I have the privilege of being a part of. And then ask the question, how do I play my part well? To help God write this story toward the flourishing of all. And social media it doesn't invite us to do that.
The other challenge, I think, Jay, is it feels like we unintentionally amplify the minority opinion in a negative way. Let's be honest, one of the beauties of social media is how it did democratize minority voice. So, for example, the Me Too movement, I'm not sure that it would have gotten traction without social media. And I think that's a very good thing, right? That these marginalized people that were being abused finally have social power to change culture. That's wonderful. But if I get specific, yesterday was the solar eclipse. And I don't know what the actual percentage is, but I'm going to guess 0.3% of pastors use the solar eclipse to talk about Jesus coming back, like where they believed that the New York City earthquake plus the solar eclipse equals a guaranteed return of Jesus.
Right.
I bet that was a very tiny minority, and yet my feed was saturated with that because reasonable people amplified that obscure, bizarre voice to speak against it.
Yeah.
There is something weird where I believe I must stand up for what is true. I don't know how to let the ball go back to the catcher. I have to swing at every pitch that comes. I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah. There's this comedian, Bo Burnham, and he's got this like wonderful Netflix special, Profound actually, and I'm gonna butcher his line, but he's got this wonderful bit where he starts talking about social media, and he asks the question, does everyone everywhere all the time have to say everything they think about everything happening all the time everywhere to everyone? Is that a thing that we have to do? It's like really beautiful and hilarious and sad, the way he sort of describes it, because it is so spot on. And again, I think we're sort of we're being duped, we're being pulled into the algorithm that pads the bottom line for these big social media mega corporations. And so it's interesting. I saw the same thing on social media. I saw like big articles, actually blog posts and articles written about this and that, in terms of the end times. And I just thought it was so interesting because I have, over the course of the last several years, I've had such a gift and a joy of being able to connect with so many pastor friends here in the Bay Area of California and across the country. And I talk to a lot of them over text. I don't have a single friend who taught on that or even thought about teaching on that this past Sunday. Yeah. I mean, not one. And yet, if you went to the internet, if an alien came down and just looked at our Facebook feeds, they would think this is the only thing anybody's talking about. And some of it comes back to Neil Postman when, he talks about information when it's detached from our local context. Now it's just entertainment, and that's not totally true. Like you said, some really beautiful sort of national and global movements have arisen because of the technologies at our disposal. But sadly, those experiences, those examples are the minority. Typically what's happening on social media is just, honestly, I would just say useless conversation that doesn't need to be had. And it's kind of a giant waste of our time and our energy that could be given to much more fruitful human interactions, particularly in our actual real contexts.
I had the great privilege of getting an early copy of your book. And for me, Jay, a genuine honor to endorse it. And so, a lot of my endorsement was around just how beautifully you wrote. Like the reason to read, listen, speak is you take us on this beautiful, gentle journey of freedom, I think, of how to navigate our complex modern digital world and how to stub our toe on the love of God in the midst of it. What are just some practical ways we can listen, speak in 2024? Those of us in North America, we have an election year. It's unlikely that we're going to relax our way into this election year. So what are some practical things we can do to listen, speak for our election? And then I'll follow up talking about our connection to God and some things we can do there.
Yeah. I mean, practically, I would say the temptation for me often is to think about God as commentary to my life, rather than thinking about God as my life. In the New Testament, the writer tells us Christ is your life. like not your life is just in Christ, but like Jesus is your life. When Paul says, like, for me to live is Christ, and therefore to die is gain. To die is to be with him who is my life. So that's the first thing I would say. Rather than thinking about God and his voice as sort of supplemental commentary to the primary soundtrack of your life, whatever that might be. And it might be social media, or during the election cycle, it might be news media, your news channel, cable news network of choice, or whatever. Like, that often becomes the primary soundtrack of our lives. And then what we're asking God to do is be sort of like supplemental commentary around that soundtrack of choice. I think we need to reverse that. And to do that, it just comes down to me. It's like, it just comes down to the beautiful, simple stuff I learned as a kid growing up in Sunday school. That in my late teens and early 20s, I just became way too sophisticated for that. I was like, oh, read the Bible? Like, really? Oh, daily prayer? Really? That's going to be the thing? I mean, come on. But that has become the thing. So getting really granular and practical. This is descriptive, not prescriptive, but what has been so helpful for me, a few things that I do. One, I pray the Lord's Prayer every single morning, and it's ritual. So I drop my children off at school, and then I pray the Lord's Prayer for them. So, our Father in heaven, you are Harper's father, you are Simon's father, your name's holy. And I just pray your kingdom would come and your will be done in Harper's life, that your kingdom would come and your will be done in Simon's life, whatever that will may be today. And on and on. Give Harper the daily bread she needs with her friends and emotionally. And, so I just pray that the Lord's Prayer for my children and for my wife every morning. And then every evening, my family, for the last year or so, my kids are young, so it's a struggle sometimes with them, but they're really getting the hang of it now. Every evening as a family, we pray the Examen together, which is there's a movement, it's this ancient Ignatian practice of the Examen. So practices like that, to begin my day with the Lord's Prayer, to end my day as a family with the Examen. It's become an anchor. And there's other practices too, but those have become anchors where the voice of God is the thing that I am listening to most, or at least trying. And then every other voice I hear in between the beginning and the end of my day, that's all commentary. That's all commentary to the primary soundtrack, which is listening for the voice of God.
That's why I love the book so much, is you're not encouraging us to be Essenes where we're out in the desert cut off from it. You're actually encouraging us to navigate our complex digital world by containing it with God's voice. You've given us such a gift, Jay. I don't know if you realize as you were sharing, when you share about your spiritual practices, they're so concrete. So that me and my listeners and the viewers on YouTube can now say, oh, I can incorporate the Lord's Prayer into the people I love. I feel like what God was prompting me is, man, this is a way I can pray for my enemy. I can actually insert my enemy's name into the Lord, whoever's irritating to me, or my political enemy, this kind of thing. But I feel the same way when I was listening to you talk about going to the Chicago Museum of Art. When you said, oh, I'm going to not have my phone on for 3 hours, my body said, oh, no. My first reaction was, well, what if someone needs to get a hold of you, Jay? Which only goes to show how addicted I am. What might be another slower practice that you have that takes more time? Because that was really a tangible, helpful one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm borrowing this from Andy Crouch, the dear friend, and been such an influence on me along these lines. So this is just, again, descriptive for us. We try to dock our phones in a particular place when we're together as a family. So our phones all stay in the kitchen. They stay in the kitchen all night. We treat them almost as like pets at home, like they don't crawl into bed with us. The phone doesn't sit on my nightstand. It used to. It doesn't anymore. I have a normal alarm clock. You can still get those on Amazon. You don't have to have your phone. There was a time before phones when people still got up at the right time with these things called analog alarm clocks. So those sorts of things, digital Sabbaths, an hour a day a week a year. And I've come to really cherish those. In fact, it's longer than that for me now because I cherish it so much. My family and I just spent a handful of days in Joshua Tree last week, and there's no cell reception up there, and it's like so beautiful. I still have my phone because I had downloaded the map of Joshua Tree. I needed to know where to get, but nothing else worked on my phone except the time and that map, and it was great. So the only time I pulled it out was to take some pictures of my kids and the scenery from time to time, and then just to drive from one hiking trail to the next. And man, it is a taste and see reality. I know it sounds jarring to like not have your phone for 3 hours, but do it. Do it for a little while and you will taste and see just how good it is, and you'll remember, like, I think you'll remember, oh, this is what it's like to just be human, a detached from digital, analog embodied, fully present human. And just because we don't have our phones doesn't mean we're fully present. There's a whole other slew of things that we got to discuss about that, but it certainly helps. It certainly helps.
Jay, you have delighted in two precious children. You have stepped in as a lead pastor following a healthy leader, where you came in after a healthy leader with a healthy transition. You have spent time around trees that are hundreds of years old, but you have not yet succumbed to the gauntlet of anxiety questions. Tell us about a time in the last few weeks where you were at peace.
Yeah. I'm so grateful because I've had several, but the one that comes to mind is the story I just shared, these few days that I spent with my family in Joshua Tree. After Easter for the last few years, as a new tradition for my family, I end Easter services and then my family will go to a national park where I'm there with the people I love most on this planet, feeling really, really small. That's really why I do it. I just go, you stand in Joshua Tree for 2 minutes and you realize, holy smokes, I am a tiny little speck living on a giant rock spinning through the galaxy, and maybe I'll be here for 70 years and then that's that. But this giant rock will keep spinning. And yet the God who made the giant rock and the cosmos within which it exists knows me, loves me, and is as close as my very next breath right here in Joshua Tree. So that's, I do that every year, and I did that last week, and it's the most peace I've felt in a long time.
Very good. In your leadership, where do you keep running into yourself? What's a trait that you keep tripping over that you wish would go away?
I had an epiphany, actually, this past year, just a few months ago, actually. But long story short, I've come to realize that when I walk into a room, I feel comfortable in two very extreme spaces of the room and very uncomfortable in between. I feel very comfortable in the very front of the room with all eyes on me, or I feel very comfortable in the very back of the room with no eyes on me. And I realize that is reflected in my leadership. I have a tendency to either get big and take control, or to completely try to relinquish responsibility. And just say, and I'll use the words of healthy leaders, to cover my own stuff, which is like, oh, I trust my team, and a lot of that is true, but I think that there's intertwined in there a sort of inability to navigate the messiness that is the middle, sort of shoulder to shoulder with others. Certainly, I am in the trenches with the people that I serve and lead, but I struggle. I struggle in those spaces. And what I'm realizing about myself is that I don't think our team would say that I'm aloof. I think I am pretty personable and available, but I see the potential for detachment and for aloofness. And honestly, that scares me a little bit.
I'd love to have a further conversation about that. And I think I'm probably violating my own gauntlet here by turning this into a conversation. But I do have a theory on it, because I don't think, here's my theory, Jay. I don't think it's your personality. I think the role of lead pastor generates that in most lead pastors I know, and it generated it in me. I was so surprised that after a few years of being in that lead chair, I would walk into rooms anxious, like socially anxious.
Yeah.
And the best I can figure it out for now, I'd love to chat more, but I think it's because we're always wearing two hats or more with everybody. And the multiple hats, the complexity of the relationships. Whenever I've been in a room with a fairly famous person, they have figured out how to put everyone at ease in that room, where they walk around and the people who are healthy and very famous, what they tend to do is go out of the way to introduce themselves to every single person in that room, spend some time with everyone. But you and I are not very famous. We're in this weird middle ground of being known in every room we walk into without that fame element. And it's weird, man. I totally get it. Like if I'm on stage, I can relax. If I'm obscure, I can relax. But that middle ground, it kind of does something to you, I think. I don't know how does that sit with you?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, speaking of lead pastoring, you're the first guest I've asked this. This is a new gauntlet question that I'm really excited about. Before I ask it, I do need to put a caveat. Let me just say, Jay, I know you agree. I think every pastoral abuse should be exposed. I think abuse that is kept in hidden and secret is unhealthy. And what is also true is there's nothing like the local church. So what is something, Jay, that the local church offers that you cannot get anywhere else?
Yeah. For me, there's so much, but the first thing that comes to mind is, speaking of being human-sized, the local church has, for me, offered the tremendous gift of a story, a narrative that is profound and beautiful and historic, in every sense of that word. I think I've become, I don't know if I've always been this way, but I've grown accustomed to enjoying feeling small in a big place, and at the same time feeling totally seen. Those two things have to exist together. If I just feel small, then it's really destructive. But if all I do is feel seen and big, that's destructive to my soul as well. I love the feeling of being small but totally seen, intimacy in the expanse. That's the gift that the church has offered me. Every time we gather, I remember that we are gathering alongside 2 billion followers of Jesus around the world, that day or that weekend. And that's such a beautiful gift. And then 2, that we are continuing on in a tradition that has been ongoing around the person of Jesus for 2 millennia and the people of God as a whole for thousands of years. And I think that's the gift, especially in the hyper individualistic, autonomous, lonely sort of age that we are living in.
As a pastor, do you experience a gap between what you believe about God versus what you experience from God?
Yeah, I've been talking a lot in this conversation. I talk a lot about it in Listen, Listen, Speak about the nearness of God and him being as close as my very next breath. But my actual visceral, lived, embodied experience of that is sporadic. It is sporadic. I intellectually know it. But another thing I do every morning is I read a psalm every morning as I sort of pour over my coffee before the kids are awake. And it's so delightful and helpful and comforting because I can so relate to what feels like really sort of manic emotionalism on the page, that psalmists are able to say, the words that Jesus utters on the cross, like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then by the end of that chapter, it's like, you've heard my cries, and you're with me. And I think that's my life. My guess is that's probably most people's experiences of God as well. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's certainly a biblical thing. The psalmists felt that way too. But there is a dissonance there because intellectually, I never stop intellectually believing that God is near. There's a gap between that knowledge and my lived experience. But I don't even necessarily know that gap is a bad thing.
Is there an event or a person or a place that you can just go back to time and time again? You're like, this is a guaranteed place where I feel fully and completely loved.
Yeah. I mean, the gift, one of the tremendous gifts of my life is um, I don't have a lot of close friends, but I have lots of friends, I think, and plenty of acquaintances. But the few very close friends I have, I mean, there's a depth there that's really, really, truly meaningful. And so, of course, there is my family, Jenny. I had a meeting cancel this morning, and my first thought was to call my wife because she's got the week off of work and ask if she was free for coffee, and she was. And that's a real gift. So there's always Jenny. But I've got a couple of really dear friends who don't live nearby. So the geography makes it challenging. But every time I'm with them, and some of them, a couple of them, I don't even really get to see all that often, maybe once a year or so. But it is one of those things where I think many of us have this. The moment we're together, it's like, oh, this is just like, we're picking up right where we left off sort of situation. So yeah, those friendships are real gifts to me. And I think what makes them so special is not that, they're primarily interested in what I do or what I produce or create, but they're interested in, who I am and who I'm becoming, not because they have a vested interest in necessarily me becoming a particular type of person, but because they're just actually interested. They have genuine curiosity toward me and my life. And I think that's the real gift. And I have genuine curiosity toward them and their life as well. And curiosity is a gift that I think is really underrated. And they offer me that gift, and I think I offer it to them as well.
My guest is Jay Kim, author of several books, all of them, I can tell you, amazing. His most recent, just released, Listen, Listen, Speak. This is the book, guys, to survive 2024. It's so beautiful and practical. Just reading it will bring you relief. That was my experience with it. I was very proud to endorse it. I'm proud to know Jay and have worked with him up close. You can follow Jay's work, of course, through his work, but he's also a pastor at Westgate Church in Silicon Valley, the perfect place to write such a book. Jay, thanks for coming on Being Human.
Always a joy, Steve. Love you and your work. Thanks for having me on.